An unleashed leader is someone who is moving and constantly moving towards their untapped potential, constantly learning, growing, and evolving, screwing up, making mistakes, and then also inviting those around them to make the same mistakes and grow and evolve with them.
Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast, where we work with willing leaders to accelerate the changes you seek. We'll learn from the experiences of different leaders facing real challenges and distill practical, purposeful steps to apply in your context. I'm Lee Scott, your curious co-pilot. Together, let's make positive changes for our companies and communities. Welcome to the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Today, we're joined by Jen Arnold. She is the CEO of Growth Signals based in Nevada. They are a training and development firm that's been operating in that region for about the last 7 years and bringing the expertise today on broadening our understanding of what it means to have a good well-being at work, the impact a leader can have on that, and looking specifically when we have peer-to-peer challenges with that healthy relationship, how can we navigate it accordingly? Jen, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Lane. Glad to be here.
Jen, tell us a little bit about what your organization is doing and the types of clients you're serving and some of the skills you bring to bear.
We've been in business, as you said, for about 7 years, and we train employees and leaders in the topics of resilience. So, building some of the resistance to the stress, as well as training managers to be better leaders so that they don't get burnout and then they could be better leaders to their people. I was a leader in corporate America and it was trial by fire. And I have really good stories. In fact, I start some of my leadership trainings being like, here's how not to screw up like me.
And with that whole space, you're talking about what a difference a leader does have on not just the performance, but even the well-being of that person. And we were talking a little bit about a study that was showing that when you look at the different dimensions of a person's life, their spouse, their access to healthcare, their relationship with their physician, they looked at all those factors. The leader ranked in the top three, and I think they were like tied with the spouse. Was that what the data was showing there, Jen?
Yeah, I think it was like 69%. It was even higher, the impact on mental health, it's high. And when you think about it, that's who you interact with the most. We talk about senior leaders, they make such an impact on the culture, but more often than not, you're not interfacing with the executive team, you're interfacing with your leader. So it makes a big impact.
Yeah. I remember when I got into direct supervision, the running joke was like going, hey, if you weren't quite good enough to be a therapist, go ahead and get into management because you end up being an amateur therapist. You are the source of their stress, but you can also be a source of uplifting and elevating them. And it's a pretty powerful two-way street because if you are that important to their mental health and their ability to access their creativity and their talents, that in turn is what's going to determine their ability to perform and contribute and serve your clients. So it's pretty powerful when we realize what an impact we have on each other.
Absolutely. And, I don't ever expect managers to be the best manager. It's just caring about your people. And then you can overlook a lot of the small things because there's rarely perfect managers.
Wait, rarely. You mean there is possibility that it could happen?
I did a training once and we are talking about who's your best leader? Who's your worst leader? One person in the training said, I've never had a good leader. I don't know if she's just a harsh critic or that's true. I mean, I've definitely had some in my past. I've been one in my past, made some major mistakes, but I've also had some that you take the good with the bad. And as long as that good, that they care about you and then they care about your growth and development, as long as that's there, you can usually overlook some flaws. And of course, if the trust is there.
Absolutely. Well, we're going to build on that trust here in a second, but I just wanted a moment here. Could you expand a little bit on, we're using this word like wellness and well-being and mental health and culture in kind of these big, giant, fuzzy ways. You've got a really unique take on it and broader perspective of what that means. Could you summarize what those dimensions are and where does a leader have opportunity to influence some of those dimensions?
Let me go a little trip down memory lane for a second. So, my background is in health and well-being. So, that's where I spent the majority of my corporate career. And one thing that got me a little disenfranchised with the concept of wellness is that you'd have this organizational culture, and then people would just incentivize them to do some little physical activity things. And that was supposed to be wellness. Meanwhile, leaders were crap. People didn't have clear expectations, suffering in silence, dreading work all day. And I was like, this doesn't match. It's just one more thing that you're asking employees to do. So that got me into just a different frame of reference with it. Trying to turn that tide is a little bit more difficult. But one of the areas of well-being that I really focus on is career development. And so I subscribe to the Gallup model, which has 5 dimensions of well-being. One of them I just said was career, like having purpose doesn't have to have this major doing all the good, but just having a purpose for getting up every day. Work is energizing you versus depleting you. There's financial, that's a huge carrier of stress. Community, feeling at the very baseline, safe otherwise, feeling connected to your community. Then you've got the physical, what everyone thinks about with wellness. And then finally, social, so feeling connected to people. But the one thing I want to say about this five-dimensional model, I think there has been a lot of expectations to put on organizations to solve all these problems for employees. And I don't think they have to be all the things to all the employees. Focus on their career.
Well, it's like folks trying to delegate all that it takes to raise a child and prepare them to be an effective contributing member of society and a citizen. But how do we bring the things that we can bring, like providing access to them using their strengths at work to be able to remind them of the purpose and the impact that they have? And I think oftentimes it is just reminding. It's not like there isn't a purpose.
Absolutely. There are so many frontline jobs that we forget how important they are because everything's glamorized and we forget about the people who help our society function, the trash collectors, the janitor, like all of those people contribute. And if the leader can say, "Hey, you matter. Hey, it's important when you show up." I'll give you another quick story. My brother works in landscaping and it's backbreaking. It's in Alabama. It's a million trillion degrees with humidity. And he doesn't work for the best company. He'd been sitting there getting a low wage job. All of a sudden, he had a new manager start. That new manager advocated for him to get a $2 raise, which is huge, right? Because that leader said to him, "Hey, you matter. You've been here for 2 years without a raise." And without that leader, he would have suffered in silence.
Yeah. All those little things start to compound. Well, let's talk a little bit about this notion of trust. Let's start with probably the simplest scenario where you're officially the supervisor. You realize now what an impact you have on their well being, and you realize what that impact has on your team's performance. What can you do to help build the trust so you have the capacity to have conversations when you see that person maybe he's being burned out or maybe feeling frustrated or maybe he's not bringing the same mojo that they used to bring? What can you do to build that trust so that you then have access? You're going to assume everything's fine, and then you're going to wake up one day and you realize you're both are far below where you could have been.
Yes, we took a little step back because what's annoying me now is that we're expecting these managers to have these high stakes mental health conversations with their employees. They may not have the emotional intelligence to do it. They may have zero trust. They need to have the skills, and that trust builds on day one. But before you can get there, I feel like there's a few different layers. And I think the most outer basic level is stating the expectations and following through on those expectations, right? So it's important for this world of remote work and hybrid. Everyone needs to be in on Tuesday and Thursday. Okay, cool. There's the expectation. They may not be happy about it. They know it. But then don't you not show up on a Tuesday or Thursday or not tell people who aren't showing up because then they're going to be like, she said that was the expectation, but they're not following through. So there's trust gone. As a leader, that was tough for me because I'm one of those people who likes to figure things out or I want people to figure it out, but I don't always give them the best instructions. The second layer is doing what you say you're going to do, which again seems easy. How many times has a leader canceled a one on one? So if you say you're going to be there, be there. If you say there's a promotion happening, have a promotion or at least give them some kind of update. And then finally, kind of at the center, I call compassionate candor. So being very honest, that is, you're going to be as honest as you can be, right? So it's saying, as a leader, I don't know the answer. I'm not sure. I'm feeling a little stressed out right now, but guess what? We have to do it because the leader has to go first.
You're undermining those fundamental trust building opportunities. And nobody gets it right all the time. I've done all of the sins that you can imagine. Not your intention, but sometimes it still happens. And when it does happen, own it and do work very hard to not have it happen in the first place. It's also about frequency. Every interaction, the higher the frequency count, the stronger. So one really good positive thing can very quickly be outweighed by three minor things. It's that steady drip of just being there, and that creates a biochemical association that you're trustworthy. Now there's a possibility for some other things to happen. Not guaranteed that I'm qualified to have the conversations, but there's now going to be a little bit more openness. Let's switch gears here a bit, Jen. A lot of emphasis is put on what I call vertical leadership, leading down, leading up. But that's actually a small percentage of the people that we interact with. At any given time, I might only have one or maybe five bosses. But how many peer-to-peer relationships do we have? How many colleagues do we got to interact with? How many stakeholders are involved? How many customers? How many suppliers? Like that's a huge percentage of the people that I'm interacting with where there's the opportunity to lead with impact or not. So let's talk about situations where that peer-to-peer relationship has been stressed maybe the trust has been broken. And I'm not talking about the extremes of like workplace violence and stuff like that. Like, no, I'm talking about just the everyday, like, hey, you failed to get me the data I needed for the report, or you missed this deadline.
So Lee, when we teach on resilience, that's one of the most common stressors that comes up, right? It's not only the workload, which comes often, but it's the relationships that one person has the view that I'm showing up, giving all my effort, and people are just half-assing it. And when we are stressed, when we're feeling piled upon, when we're not getting the right sleep, that just escalates in our minds. It's this mental script that goes on. It happens all the time. One instance I can tell you about is I worked in sales and I had one of my star employees come to me and she said, "Hey, Jen, this person has asked me if I wanted to be on her team." That person was my colleague. So it was a team member who was going directly to my team member and saying, "Hey, I want you to come work for me." And luckily, we had that trust that she came to me and I was like, wow, that's a blindside. I would have expected the courtesy to say, "Hey, that person's really good on your team. What do you think about me reaching out to them?" I probably didn't play it the best way. I'll have to be honest that what my personality leans towards, whatever, just get over it, just move on, don't address it. It's gotten better over the years, but with her, I decided I was going to make a comment in a team meeting. My boss didn't see anything truly that wrong with it, but to me, it was just like a trust breaker. And so that's how I carried it. Luckily, the person ended up staying with me. But I think there are different steps that I would have taken. I can talk about what I'd advise other people because people are going to do this. I've had another colleague. We were on the same team. I moved to an external role. She was internal, threw me and my boss under the bus in a meeting in front of our boss, right? Like it happens.
If every time this happens, your story is, well, that person is just evil, never do work with them again, you're going to find pretty soon you got nobody left standing, right? Because we all make mistakes. And I also do believe there's people who do this chronically and evilly, and you should absolutely avoid them and leave the company if you need to as a result of that. But to your point, yeah, most of them are nefarious demon warlords embodied in a colleague trying to undermine society, right? They made a bad call. They got different values, bad upbringing, whatever you want to call it. So in that situation, that's happened. And yet you still got to collaborate with this person because your organization is depending on that for your team to succeed. So what does a leader do in that point? How do you move forward with that?
Well, I think the first thing is you kind of have to work through some emotions. I think that is one of the things that employers think it's too touchy-feely. I was like, no, it happens all the time. That happened to me. So I think one of the first things to do is get very clear on what's going on there. Once you break down, okay, these are all the emotions involved, processing them, I think is super helpful, which we don't spend the time doing. We're just villainizing that person.
That racket that makes us the victim and then the villain. And that might fulfill some short term ego protection mechanism, right? But it's not just one emotion, it is the emotions. It's usually a bag. And to your point, not only are emotions not just touchy feely, it's like that's where you get your energy from. So if your tank's depleted, it's because you've got emotions that are punching holes in that tank. So to take that moment, be able to articulate, it's like, yeah, what am I feeling? By now naming those emotions, now that creates a little bit of space. So it's like you aren't your emotions, you just happen to be experiencing them.
Right. And just what happens is you're just in that emotional state. And then you expend a lot of mental energy. Like, why did that person do that? It's just mentally exhausting. So by kind of working through those, you can go, okay. And then there's potentially some ownership on my part. And I think another resilient strategy that I like to talk about is acceptance and accepting that person for all their flaws. So it's saying, yeah, this person, she's more cutthroat. She cares about the competition. She's trying to build the best team. She's trying to look good in front of the boss. You may not like it, but that's how they operate. So go, okay, I understand the scenario. I understand what that person needs. And then getting on board with what kind of relationship you want with that person.
Right. Hearing it, I'm distilling this down to some steps. It's like, okay, hey, there's been a breach of trust. There's been some friction. Step one, naming your own emotions about it. So you're aware of what's happening there. Taking an opportunity to maybe understand why and where might be driving them. And acceptance doesn't mean you have to agree. It just means I accept that their value system is more competitive, cutthroat than mine. Okay. But then the third step is like, now what can I do about it with what I have under my sphere of influence? And when you define stress, it's anytime your expectations do not equal the situation. Now, maybe the situation doesn't match your expectations, but you're excited about it and it's motivating you to move forward, but that's still a type of stress. But when there's a big enough gap between your expectations and your reality, that stress. And that will drain you if you're not careful. And I think an expectation that gets us in trouble, Jen, is when we say, you know what? My expectation is that person will be different than who they are. And they should have not made the mistakes that I made and made different mistakes than I made. So they'd be like me and then my life would be easy. The moment you go to a they should or a you should, you're doomed.
That's when I talk about that mental resistance, right? So, yeah, I could have been like, that's not how a team operates. She should have come to me. Well, she's not going to. So, what am I going to do about it? Like, let me deal with my hurt feelings and let me decide. Like, for that person, I knew she was an influential person to our boss. So, I don't need to be her best friend, but I don't need to make an enemy out of her. I know what to expect from this person, like knowing what you need from that relationship and how they're going to help you get along in the organization. I think that's really important. I mean, you can get curious. I think that's a good tool. I wonder what's going on for them. Maybe she's having underperforming people and she needs this person. I mean, you're making stuff up, but at least if you're getting curious of flipping the perspective a little bit to go, hey, I wonder what they're going through. Doesn't make it right necessarily, but at least it's the curiosity mindset.
It can deanimate a little bit. Because the reality is your story about them being the villain is also made up. And I think there's also a distinction between a situational or momentary lapse in a relationship. Like normally we're pretty solid, it's good, and they just hit their threshold. They are in survival mode. Then they went to their lesser selves versus somebody where it's like, no, this is their character. I think having a little grace for the temperamental ones, and then also having grace for the permanent ones. You're just like, okay, well, that's where they are in their evolution. But being able to look at that and say, okay, now what am I going to do about it from within my sphere of influence?
Exactly, and there's some things you wanna address, and there's some things you don't need to, like asking yourself, "Is it worth the energy?" But you also have to say sometimes you say, "No, it's not worth it," because you don't wanna deal with it.
Yeah. But if you say it's not worth it, you got to make sure you're willing to be it's not worth it. You can't say it's not worth it and then carry it around because now you're suffering twice.
If I look back at these scenarios and in retrospect, as we all can go, oh, I should have done it this way, right? I think there's a couple things to consider. One of those is when you're having that conversation, which I could have easily had that conversation with her. And it's important to say, hey, I know it's really important for you to have strong account managers, but is it possible that you were looking in a place that I could have helped you? Is it possible for you to go about it a different way? Is it possible for you to come to me first? Because I am happy to get my people to your team. If that's the way we wanna go, cool, but common courtesy, right? That's what I'd ask you to do. So I think if you can approach it in a way with if you know their perspective, like, I know it's really important for you. You are a high performer, so, like, acknowledging that and then saying, "Is it possible? Could we work a different way?" I think that's helpful.
So let's back up just a little bit. You talk about having this calculation of like, is it even worth addressing this peer where you've had some friction? And let's say you've determined, no, it's not. Okay, well, then those are your rules of engagement. You know how to manage that. But let's say you choose to engage, which is kind of where you're going down here. What's the invitation to that conversation look like before you even get into the conversation?
I mean, it is tricky because you're gonna have to be intentional about it. I don't think it's also great to catch people off guard. So I think it could be a simple coffee invitation. Hey, just want to talk to you about something real quick that came up in the meeting. I just want to elaborate on it. It can be, hey, can we go for a quick walk? I just want to get something off my mind. Like it can be as simple as that. So a good vulnerable step would be, hey, I said something in that meeting that I just want to apologize for. I just want to address it in a better way. Can we just have a few minutes to chat so we can work better together? Make it 15, 20 minutes. It's just saying, hey, I know this is important to you. Our relationship's important to me. Here's what got me. How can we work better together? It's that simple, but it is intentional.
I think understanding that it's not all or nothing, not naivety, but also not shields up at the first sign of any trouble. I look back on some of the strongest and best relationships I had were from relationships that had trouble, had challenges, had friction. We invested the energy and it made us stronger. I've also had relationships that had friction, had issues, whatever. I made that effort and there was no reciprocity whatsoever. And then it was like, okay, cut bait on those. For me, being in relationships, whether it's work or personal or spiritual or whatever, there's risk involved with it. If you're going to be playing the game of leadership and you're going to be in relationships with colleagues, it's going to happen. The question is not if it's going to happen, but if you don't do anything about it, you never get anywhere. If you do something about it, either it becomes a great relationship or it becomes clear there's the relationship you do not want to be in. But either way, you get something from the effort.
I think you know because our brains don't like uncertainty. So at least you know where you stand with that person. I'd say even if it's the person who maybe you don't like or you can't build a relationship with, You could get political. Going back to my situation to where they were poaching, I had the team that could funnel into the sales team or whatever. It would have been brilliant of me to go to my boss and say, "Hey, how do we use my talent to make this sales team even stronger?" Like, huge political move. I could have said, "Okay, this happened. Cool. It's for the greater good of the team. I'm happy to have my people go into this higher level role." You could always tweak it that way too, if you can get past the emotions of it.
When I'm working with leaders, I'll ask, do you like the political aspects of leadership? And almost universally, oh, absolutely not. And I go, okay. And then come back and say, do you feel like relationships are a really important aspect of leadership? And the answer is almost universally, absolutely. Well, politics are just relationships. When you really boil it down, at the end of the day, it is still just relationships that have mixed interest, some that align, some that don't. But recognizing that operating with your peers in a political construct is still just developing relationships. And those relationships can be healthy and those relationships can be not so healthy.
Yeah, and I think it's going about it with your colleagues, regardless of your relationship with them, in a way that meets the goals you're trying to achieve that is in line with your own values. So I'm still going to stay true to my values because easily within that team I was in, they had different values than I did. I'm not going to change my values just to do that. I would never do that to somebody else. But it's moving together with your values, but you're still trying to reach mutual goals. So you need each other.
That's why one of our core values at UL is freedom. And it's like, look, at the end of the day, I want to be able to free to choose and operate within my values, which means I got to be okay with you being free to choose and operate within yours. We can disagree and we can choose to work together or not. Those are all options, but those options are where the freedom comes from.
Yes. When you trust someone, you assume good intent. And I think that's where the trust building is so helpful, whether you were the leader in your team, but definitely peers, because Lee, you made such a good point that there's a lot more peers that you have to collaborate with than your directs or your boss.
Absolutely. Jen, thanks so much for being on the show. Your expertise as a corporate leader and then sharing it now with your clients to really make career both productive and purposeful is very much appreciated. And dealing with the situations with building trust where there's been challenges and stress and peer to peer, wow, we've all dealt with it. And if we haven't yet, we're definitely going to deal with it some more.
Thanks for having me and also being honest about your screw ups because we all have them. And I think the more we all openly talk about them, the more we invite others to say, hey, it's okay.
Where can our listeners find out more about you?
Yes, I would love to connect on LinkedIn. It's just under Jen P. Arnold, or you can go to growthsignals.co.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jen.
You too.
Thank you for joining us today on the Unleashing Leaders podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss a moment that could be the key to your next breakthrough. Let's stay connected and contribute together by grabbing that @Unleashing Leaders handle on LinkedIn, YouTube, or your favorite network. This is Lee Scott. Keep learning, loving, and leading. Our future and our communities are counting on us.